Welcome to the Lion's Share podcast, where we break down today's most impactful research and bring fresh insights from the academic frontier straight to you.
Our mission today, it's a rigorous investigation into how businesses manage the absolute highest level of uncertainty, the really unpredictable stuff. We're doing this by looking at one fascinating academic paper. It's called Contract Contingencies and Uncertainty by Shi and Yeung, just published this year in the Journal of Accounting and Economics.
Yeah, and this paper really gets into a classic theoretical dilemma. It builds on that foundational idea from, Coase and Williamson years ago. Contracts are just inherently incomplete. So every business faces this huge choice up front. Do you try and spend, enormous resources predicting every possible future event and how you'll react? Or do you draft something much looser, maybe intentionally, and just plan to deal with the gaps when they appear?
Right, and what's really striking here is that these authors didn't just theorize, they actually tested this choice empirically. They gathered this massive data set of real-world contracts, over 4,000 material product market contracts, filed publicly between 1996 and 2021. And they looked at how economic uncertainty specifically affects the actual language people wrote down in these agreements. Okay, so let's unpack their findings. The core question driving this research seems pretty straightforward, right? When uncertainty in the business environment really spikes, do firms write more explicit contingency clauses, or do they write fewer?
And the methods they used were quite sophisticated. They used textual analysis, basically teaching a computer to count or quantify how often firms put in specific if this then that type clauses. And crucially, to try and prove cause and effect, they leveraged these major kind of undeniable shocks to the business world. Things like the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, use them as natural experiments.
And the headline finding. It pretty much flips the traditional thinking on its head. The results strongly support what they call dynamic models of incomplete contracting, meaning high uncertainty leads firms to write more contingencies, not fewer. They seem to lean into the complexity.
Exactly. But before we dive into the why, it's really important to frame this for, managerial relevance, for people actually using this stuff. We're not talking about your standard lease agreement or like an HR document here. These are material product market contracts. These are often the big, non-routine deals, sometimes making up more than 10% of a company's sales. They really sit right at the heart of a firm's operating and investing strategy.
Okay, so if you're a practitioner, maybe running a long-term project, this is telling you that how you design a contract isn't just a legal task. It's actually a critical governance tool, a risk management tool. The choices you make about writing contingencies signal what management expects about future risks, and maybe even more importantly, what they expect the cost of future changes or renegotiations to be.
That's right. It reveals a lot about expectations.
So let's nail down some key concepts the authors are working with here. The main thing they're measuring, the dependent variable, is the contract contingency. How should we think about that? It's like stipulating a foreseeable outcome and the action that goes with it. For instance, if this particular supply disruption lasts more than X months, then the delivery date gets pushed back by Y days, something like that.
Precisely. An if-then statement tied to a specific event. And the way they measure the presence of these is really key. They created this metric they call contingency R. Now, this isn't just about counting pages or how long the contract is. It's the proportion of different topics within the contract that actually stipulate a contingency. And importantly, it's scaled by the total number of action topics in that contract.
Okay. So if I'm getting this right, they're not just measuring length, but the density of these if-then clauses within the actual substance of the contract. That kind of levels the playing field, doesn't it? Whether the contract is 5 pages or 50 pages long?
Exactly. It controls for the scope of the agreement. Now, let's define the type of risk they're focused on. Nitrogen uncertainty. This is vital. It's not just general risk that you can, say, put a probability on, like the chance of a flood next year. Nitrogen uncertainty is more radical. It's a lack of quantifiable knowledge about the probability of something happening. You just can't reliably assign a number to it. It's the unknown unknowns to some extent.
Okay, and that leads us to the theory that seems to win out in their results, dynamic contracting models. What's the core intuition there? You mentioned Hart and Moore.
The basic idea, drawing from people like Hart and Moore, is that parties know they're probably going to have to renegotiate down the line, especially when things are really uncertain. So when that radical uncertainty is high, they actually write contingencies, maybe quite roughly, in advance. These rough clauses then act as reference points. They make future ex post amendments much cheaper and easier than starting the whole negotiation from scratch.
So they sort of expect the unexpected and try to prepare the ground for future talks, even if they can't specify everything up front.
That's the idea. Prepare the terrain for future agreement. Okay, so that covers the what's. Now we need to get into the how. Let's tackle the first big question. What exactly was the research question, and why was answering it now so important?
Right. As we've kind of laid out, the high-level question is, how does uncertainty, this nation uncertainty, influence the decision to actually write down explicit contingencies in these material contracts?
Mm-hmm. And its importance really comes down to settling that theoretical argument we mentioned. The old writing cost view always predicted that high uncertainty means fewer contingencies. It's just too hard, too costly, takes too much brain power to think through every possible weird outcome. But the dynamic models predicted the exact opposite. By using this contingency measure, which directly quantifies the explicit presence of these clauses, these authors could finally provide a really clean empirical test. It moves the whole incomplete contracting field beyond using, ambiguous proxies like just contract lengths or duration, which don't tell the full story.
Okay, that makes sense. So speaking of the theories, if the dynamic model was the winner here, what were the other main contenders they considered?
Well, they really looked at three main theoretical streams. First, as we said, the writing cost model, predicting that negative relationship, fewer contingencies with more uncertainty. Second, the dynamic models, which predicted the positive relationship, more contingencies. And that's the one their data supported. And third, there was the price protection or ownership perspective. This comes from ideas like Grossman and Hart's work. That perspective kind of argues that parties don't really bother much with contingencies when uncertainty is high. Instead, they just adjust the price up front, or they change the ownership structure. Like, maybe you just sell the asset to the party who's best placed to handle the unpredictable risks. But their empirical tests really didn't find much support for that in this context. The dynamic approach seemed to fit the data best.
Got it. Okay, now let's get to the credibility of the study. This is always crucial. How did the researchers make sure their findings weren't just showing a correlation, but actually demonstrating cause and effect? They had to somehow prove that the uncertainty was causing the changes in contract writing, right? Not just happening at the same time.
Absolutely, and this is where their research design really makes a difference. They didn't just rely on standard baseline regressions. They used these exogenous shocks, these external events, to strengthen their claim about internal validity, about causality. So for general uncertainty, they look at firms that were highly exposed to the 2008 financial crisis, maybe firms with lots of leverage, for example. And then they compare the contracts those firms wrote before the crisis hit versus after. They did a similar thing with the COVID-19 pandemic, looking at firms maybe highly reliant on face-to-face interactions.
Okay, so the logic is basically, look, we can't run a perfect lab experiment, but when something huge like 2008 or COVID hits these particularly exposed firms, we see a distinct change in their contracting behavior afterwards. And that helps rule out other potential explanations for why they changed their contracts.
Exactly. It's a quasi-natural experiment approach.
Yeah.
And they didn't stop there. For innovation uncertainty, they used the diffusion of disruptive technologies, how exposed firms were to major tech shifts happening in their industry. This focus on external, sort of undeniable events really boosts the credibility of their causal claims. And, just circling back to measurement for a second, using that contingency metric, based on very specific keywords like if, unless in the event, that ensured their construct validity was strong too. They were measuring what they intended to measure.
Okay. And quickly on the technical side, the econometrics. They used regression analysis, standard enough, but what steps did they take to ensure they weren't mixing up the effect of uncertainty with other factors, like, say, how big or profitable the firm was?
Yeah, they employed really strong controls in their models. They accounted for, well, pretty much all the major factors you'd think might influence contract writing. Things like the firm's operating performance, its complexity measured by assets or number of segments, its growth opportunities, its financial relationships like leverage or trade credit, and very importantly, they included both time-fixed effects and industry-fixed effects. This means they're controlling for any general trends happening across all industries over time, or factors specific to certain industries.
So that helps isolate the specific impact of the uncertainty measures they were interested in?
Precisely. They also clustered their standard errors at the industry level, which is appropriate since some of their key uncertainty measures were at that level. And they did robustness checks using firm-level data too, where possible.
Okay, good. So let's get to the payoff, the major results. Did they definitively answer the research question? You said yes earlier, a positive link. But let's get some numbers on that. Any aha? moments.
Yes, the research question was definitely answered. They found a consistent, robust, positive association between uncertainty and writing more contingencies. For general uncertainty, the results were solid. If you moved a firm from an industry in the bottom quartile of earnings volatility, so
Yeah.
pretty stable to the top quartile, highly volatile, that was associated with about a 0.016 increase in this contingency measure, which translates to roughly 12% of a standard deviation. So noticeable.
Okay, 12%. Not huge, but clear. What about the innovation uncertainty? You said that was stronger.
Much stronger, yeah. And this is where it gets really fascinating, I think. When they looked at industry R&D intensity, basically how much innovation is happening in the industry, an interquartile increase. So moving from a low R&D to a high R&D intensity industry.
Yeah.
That resulted in a 0.041 increase in contingency treat. That's about 31% of a standard deviation. Much bigger effect.
Wow, okay. So innovation uncertainty seems to pack a bigger punch on contract writing.
It does. But here's the really critical distinction they found. It wasn't just about any R&D. They found that the R&D intensity of a firm's competitors, their peers, had a significantly stronger impact on its contingency writing than the firm's own R&D spending did.
Hold on, that's a huge strategic insight, isn't it? It suggests firms aren't primarily writing these extra clauses because they're worried about their own R&D projects failing internally. They're writing them because they're worried about what their competitors might do, like a rival suddenly developing a breakthrough technology.
That seems to be exactly it. They're hedging against the risk of competitive disruption, the risk that a rival is going to suddenly leapfrog them, change the whole market dynamic, and force a need to adjust the contract.
So competitive uncertainty is perhaps the biggest driver here. Fascinating.
It really points to that external pressure as key for contract design.
Okay, so wrapping up the findings then. The main conclusion is strong empirical backing for these dynamic contracting models. More uncertainty leads to more, albeit rougher, contingencies. But beyond just showing the association, how do they really nail down the mechanism? How do they convince us that the reason firms do this is, as the theory suggests, to lower future renegotiation costs?
Right, showing the mechanism is crucial. They provided two really compelling pieces of evidence for that. First, they looked at situations where you'd expect future renegotiation to be particularly difficult or costly. For instance, when the two parties signing the contract were known business rivals. In those cases, the positive link between uncertainty and contingency way was significantly stronger. Conversely, when renegotiation was expected to be relatively easy, maybe the parties had a long-standing prior relationship, or one was a major customer of the other, that positive link was weaker.
Ah, okay. That makes perfect sense. If you know arguing later is going to be a nightmare because you fundamentally don't trust your counterparty, you'd better invest more effort up front, creating at least a rough roadmap for potential disagreements.
Precisely. It really validates that cost reduction motive. And the second piece of evidence relates back to that rough drafting idea we touched on. They found that while higher uncertainty led to more contingency clauses overall, those same high uncertainty measures were negatively associated with the actual length of each individual contingency clause.
So more clauses, but each one is shorter, less detailed.
Exactly, which fits perfectly with this idea of writing a quick, sort of rough reference point. It's designed to make ex post amendment cheaper and easier, rather than trying, perhaps futilely, to spell out every single tiny detail in advance when the future's so murky.
That is a phenomenal synthesis. This deep dive really shows, I think, how these incomplete contracting theories, which can seem quite abstract, can actually be tested rigorously in the real world. Looking at these complex, material business contracts gives us direct insight into how firms grapple with that radical Nietzschean uncertainty.
It connects contract design directly to high-level strategic risk management. It shows that firms aren't necessarily aiming for perfect contractual completeness when faced with deep uncertainty. Instead, they might be strategically using a kind of targeted intentional incompleteness, these rough reference points, as a tool to actually streamline governance when the future is fundamentally unknowable.
So let's bring it back to you, the listener, maybe the strategic decision maker or project leader. What does this all mean? If the real value of adding a contingency when uncertainty is sky high isn't necessarily the specific action you write down, but simply the shared agreement that this type of event is foreseeable, that it creates a reference point, then maybe spending endless hours pre-specifying detailed actions for every low probability event is the wrong goal entirely. So here's the provocative thought to maybe mull over for your next big long-term project or that really high-stakes negotiation. When you're facing huge R&D risk or massive technological uncertainty, should you perhaps spend less time trying to draft the perfect response for every unlikely scenario, and instead focus your energy purely on making sure your contract explicitly names and categorizes the types of unforeseeable risks that will automatically trigger a mandatory, structured, and pre-agreed upon renegotiation process? How does deliberately embracing that kind of structured incompleteness change how you think about managing risk and documenting it internally?
That's a really critical question, I think. For modern project governance and strategic contracting, we definitely encourage you to maybe use this framework to look at the contracts you deal with.
And that wraps up our deep dive for today. We hope you feel thoroughly well informed.
Thanks for tuning into the Lion's Share podcast. If you enjoyed today's discussion, share it with a friend and join us next time for more ideas worth talking about. We'll see you next time.